Saturday morning, before most of the country had even finished its coffee, the United States pulled the trigger on a 50% tariff aimed squarely at Canada. Within hours, Ottawa answered with a date. Not a threat, not a warning. A date. September the 8th. That is the day this trade fight stops being a war of words and turns into something with real invoices, real factory floors, and real consequences on both sides of the border. According to the Associated Press, the tariffs actually went into effect just after midnight Saturday, hitting close to $20 billion worth of Canadian goods flowing into the United States. And according to Reuters, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney did not wait long to respond. He stood in front of cameras in Ottawa that same morning and said his government would match Washington, as he put it, dollar for dollar. For a story this large, you need to understand something right away. This is not the opening chapter of a new conflict. This is the latest and arguably the sharpest chapter in a fight that has been building for more than a year and a half. To understand why a 50% tariff and a September the 8th retaliation date matter so much, you have to go back to February of 2025, when this entire confrontation began. Back then, President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on almost all Canadian goods entering the United States, with a slightly lower 10% rate applied to energy, critical minerals, and potash. The justification, according to the White House at the time, was a declared national emergency over the flow of illicit fentanyl and undocumented migration across the northern border. Canadian officials pushed back immediately, arguing that the volume of fentanyl crossing from Canada was a tiny fraction of what crosses the southern border. But the tariffs went ahead regardless, taking effect in early March of 2025. It is worth pausing here on something that multiple outlets, including CBS News and ABC News, made a point of noting even while reporting on the newest round of tariffs. The United States and Canada have wrangled over trade for decades, poking at each other over sore spots like softwood lumber and dairy market access long before Trump's second term began. And somehow, despite all of that, the two countries have generally still managed to remain close friends, military allies, and major trading partners. That long history of managing disagreement without a full rupture is part of why this particular escalation, culminating in an actual 50% tariff and a firm September the 8th retaliation date, has struck so many observers as a genuinely serious break from the normal pattern, rather than just another round of the usual back and forth. Ottawa did not sit still. Canada answered with its own retaliatory tariffs, first on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, and within weeks, that number expanded to cover a much larger slice of trade between the two countries. From that point forward, the relationship between Washington and Ottawa followed a familiar and exhausting pattern. Tariff, counter-tariff, threat, response, pause, renewed threat. By April of 2025, Trump's sweeping 25% tariffs on imported automobiles took hold, and Carney matched that rate with tariffs on non-compliant vehicles crossing from the United States into Canada. 2 months later, in June of 2025, a 50% tariff on foreign steel and aluminum came into force worldwide, squeezing Canadian metal exporters who had, for decades, treated the American market as practically domestic. Carney threatened to respond in kind on steel and aluminum starting in July. According to the Canadian outlet Global News, this entire pattern echoes something Trump himself did during his first term in office. Back in 2018, while the United States was in the middle of renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, Trump imposed tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, tying those tariffs directly to the difficulty of the broader trade talks underway at the time. That earlier standoff eventually produced the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the very deal now up for its scheduled review. Analysts cited by Global News note that Trump's second-term approach has followed a similar playbook, but with far higher tariff rates and a far more aggressive negotiating posture than anything seen during the original agreement's creation. It is also worth understanding just how far back some of these specific trade fights actually go, because tariffs on Canadian goods rarely start from nothing. According to the Congressional Research Service, the dispute over Canadian softwood lumber, the wood used heavily in American residential construction, stretches back decades. The last formal agreement governing that particular trade expired all the way back in October of 2015, and ever since then, the United States has applied anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Canadian lumber shipments, making softwood lumber one of the longest-running irritants in the entire relationship, one that predates Trump's second term by nearly a decade. When Canada's retaliation first began back in February of 2025, it did not arrive all at once. According to the Canadian government's own order in council, published by the law firm Blake's, Canada's first wave, described as Phase 1, applied a 25% retaliatory tariff to roughly 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods starting February the 4th. A second and much larger wave, Phase 2, was expected roughly 21 days later, covering an additional 125 billion Canadian dollars in American products. That second phase gives you a sense of just how quickly this dispute was designed to escalate from the very beginning, with Canada holding a much bigger economic response in reserve depending on how Washington behaved. Then, in what many analysts described as a genuinely strange detour, the two countries found themselves arguing over a digital services tax that Canada had planned to apply to major American technology companies. Trump threatened to walk away from trade talks entirely over it. Ottawa backed down, delaying and eventually shelving the tax, a decision that some Canadian commentators criticized as capitulation and others defended as pragmatic damage control. The second half of 2025 brought no relief. On August the 1st, a heightened 35% tariff rate hit a range of Canadian goods, timed to coincide with a separate global 50% tariff on imported copper. Trump, at various points that year, threatened a full 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Ottawa moved forward with a broader trade agreement with China, a threat that never actually materialized, after Carney insisted Canada had no such plans. Trump also floated and later abandoned 50% tariff, specifically targeting Canadian aircraft sold into the American market, and even threatened briefly to block the opening of a new Canadian-built bridge across the Detroit River. Then came a legal earthquake. In February of 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case known as Learning Resources versus Trump that the president did not actually have the authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose the sweeping tariffs he had been using against Canada, Mexico, and dozens of other trading partners. It was a major blow to the legal foundation of the entire tariff campaign. The administration did not retreat from tariffs altogether, though. Instead, it pivoted, ending the specific emergency powers tariff actions and replacing them with a temporary 10% import surcharge under a different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, while keeping a separate set of tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, copper, lumber, furniture, heavy vehicles, and semiconductors firmly in place under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. In plain terms, one legal tool was struck down by the courts, and the administration simply reached for another. It is worth noting that the Learning Resources case was not the only legal challenge working its way through the courts at the time. A related case, known as V, OS Selections versus United States, was also being closely watched by trade lawyers as the Supreme Court weighed the broader question of just how far a president's emergency economic powers actually extend, a legal question with consequences reaching far beyond Canada alone, since the same emergency powers had been used to justify tariffs against dozens of other countries simultaneously. There is another detail worth including here, because it shapes how large this dispute actually feels on the ground versus how it looks in a tariff percentage. According to ABC News, due to a range of exemptions carved out for certain categories of goods, the 50% tariffs that took effect Saturday were expected to hit only a fraction of total American imports from Canada, even though the list of affected products, dairy items, honey, whey protein, molasses, and alcoholic beverages among them, reads as broad on paper. Separately, goods that are properly certified as compliant with the United States-Mexico-Canada. Agreements' specific rules of origin continue to enter the United States largely duty-free, and are largely, though not entirely, shielded from these newer tariff actions, which is part of why so much of this fight has come to center on which products qualify for that certification, and which do not. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of something even bigger looming on the calendar. Under the terms of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the three countries are required to conduct a mandatory joint review of that entire trade pact by July of 2026, the first review of its kind under any American free trade agreement. According to the Congressional Research Service, if the countries fail to agree to extend it, the agreement does not collapse immediately, but it does face an eventual expiration date in 2036, with growing uncertainty in the years leading up to that point. Canadian business groups, including the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, have been warning for months that constant tariff whiplash from Washington is making it nearly impossible for companies to plan long-term investment, regardless of how the legal disputes over presidential tariff authority eventually settle. So that is the long road that led to this past week. And this past week alone had more twists than most trade disputes see in a year. According to CNBC, negotiators from both countries spent the entire week leading up to Saturday locked in what one report called furious round-the-clock talks. Canada's trade minister for the United States, Dominic LeBlanc, told reporters on Thursday that a deal was, in his words, very close. Just 2 days before that, on Tuesday, Trump had actually paused the looming 50% tariff for a 3-day window, posting online that the two sides had reached a deal or were on the verge of one. For a moment, it looked like the story was heading toward resolution rather than escalation. Then, late Friday night, everything fell apart. According to NBC News, Carney issued a statement suspending the trade talks altogether, citing what he called last-minute changes to the terms the United States had proposed changes he described bluntly as unfair and uneconomic. The clock ran out at midnight Eastern Time, and the 50% tariffs, the ones that had briefly been paused just days earlier, went into effect anyway, early Saturday morning, hitting close to $20 billion worth of Canadian exports. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely contested, and it deserves to be treated that way rather than smoothed over. The United States Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, posted on social media early Saturday morning blaming Canada directly, saying that Ottawa had declined to finalize a trade deal under terms both sides had reportedly agreed to earlier in the week. According to Al Jazeera, Greer later laid out specifics, saying the American offer would have included significant tariff reductions on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber in exchange for supply chain coordination in aerospace, tougher enforcement against goods made with forced labor, cooperation on critical minerals, and the formal launch of renewed United States-Mexico-Canada agreement negotiations. From the American side, this was framed as a generous offer that Canada simply walked away from. Carney's version of events, delivered at that same Saturday press conference in Ottawa, was very different. He said Canada had actually been willing to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, and to encourage Canadian provinces to lift their bans on American alcohol sales, if Washington had been willing to substantially lower its own tariffs in return. But, he said, the final American demands went, in his words, too far. He put it this way to reporters: they asked too much and offered too little. When a reporter at that same news conference asked Carney directly why it felt like he was taking the country to war, his answer was short and pointed: because we were attacked. According to Australia's ABC News, Carney described Canada's approach throughout the entire negotiation as one built around securing the best possible agreement. Never a deal at any price or on any deadline. Language that frames Ottawa's decision to let talks collapse rather than accept unfavorable terms as a deliberate choice rather than a failure. Al Jazeera separately reported that Carney described Canada's posture throughout the process as pragmatic, patient, and persistent, repeatedly emphasizing that his government was not going to rush into an agreement simply because a deadline was approaching, even one set by the President of the United States himself. This is exactly the kind of moment where a story like this has to slow down and separate verified fact from spin on both sides. What is verified, confirmed by multiple named outlets including the Associated Press, Reuters, and the Washington Post, is that the 50% tariffs took effect Saturday, that they cover roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, and that Carney has publicly committed to a September the 8th retaliation date targeting specific sectors. What remains contested, and depends entirely on which side you ask, is who actually walked away from the table first, and whether the American offer was as generous as Greer described it, or as insufficient as Carney described it. Neither government has released the full text of the proposed terms publicly, so viewers should treat both accounts as competing narratives rather than settled fact. What is not in dispute is the scope of what the American tariffs actually hit. According to the Washington Post and corroborated by CBS News, the list of affected goods is surprisingly broad and, at times, oddly specific. It includes wine, furniture, dairy products, cement, clothing, fishing rods, hockey equipment, honey, whey protein, molasses, and alcoholic beverages, including whiskey and vodka. President Trump's own team noted that the tariffs would touch roughly 5 to 5.5% of everything Canada ships into the United States annually, a relatively narrow slice of the overall trading relationship, but one concentrated in politically sensitive industries, including some tied directly to Canadian farmers and rural manufacturers. And what did Carney actually announce for the Canadian side of this fight? Standing in Ottawa, he confirmed that Canada's response would take effect the Tuesday after Labor Day, which lands on September the 8th. The retaliatory tariffs, he said, would be concentrated in a focused set of sectors, specifically steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. He described the American tariffs as, in his own words, a miscalculation, and confirmed that further details of the Canadian measures would be released in the coming days. Carney also stressed that his government was taking this step reluctantly, acknowledging publicly that some of these retaliatory measures will raise costs and reduce choice for Canadian consumers themselves, a rare moment of a leader openly admitting his own countermeasures carry a domestic price tag. President Trump did not stay quiet for long. According to CBS News, he posted on his social media platform overnight Saturday, writing that Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one. He went on to claim that Canada has, in his words, charged our great farmers massive amounts of tariffs for years, a reference to Canada's long-standing supply management system that restricts and taxes imports of American dairy products. That dairy dispute, by the way, is not new. According to the Congressional Research Service, the United States Trade Representative has formally challenged Canada's dairy quota system twice already under the terms of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. with mixed results in both cases, and in June of 2025, Canada actually passed legislation preventing its own government from raising dairy, poultry, or egg import quotas in any future trade negotiation. That single piece of Canadian domestic law is quietly one of the most persistent flashpoints in this entire multi-year dispute. The political reaction inside Canada has been anything but unified, and that matters just as much as the international back and forth. According to multiple outlets, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who governs Canada's most populous province and has significant sway over national economic policy, given Ontario's manufacturing base, gave Carney his full support, saying the Prime Minister had backing for retaliation, tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar, and insisting that everything needs to be on the table. Ontario is home to a large share of Canada's steel and automotive production, so Ford's support is not symbolic. It is coming from the province with the most direct exposure to this fight. Throughout this year and a half of escalation, Trump has also repeatedly used rhetoric that goes beyond ordinary trade negotiation language, rhetoric that has done real damage to how Canadians view the relationship. According to the Globe and Mail, he has gone as far as suggesting Canada could become, in his words, the 51st state. A comment paired with those on again, off-again waves of new tariffs that the Globe and Mail describes as having outraged many Canadians and hardened public support for Ottawa's own retaliatory measures, even among Canadians who might otherwise have preferred a more conciliatory approach toward Washington. Not every provincial leader has been equally enthusiastic. Reporting from NBC News noted that Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew pushed back at points during the week as negotiators worked toward a possible deal, reflecting a broader unease among some provinces about how far Ottawa should go in matching Washington tariff for tariff, particularly given how badly earlier rounds of retaliation, including provincial bans on American alcohol sales introduced back in 2025, have already strained cross-border commerce in both directions. American political reaction has not been unified either, and it would be misleading to present this as Republicans uniformly cheering the tariffs while Democrats uniformly oppose them. According to reporting from The Hill, former Vice President Mike Pence said publicly that the last thing the American economy needs right now is a trade war with Canada, a notable break from full-throated support for the administration's approach, coming from within Republican political circles. The Hill also reported that Senator Susan Collins asked the White House to seriously weigh the negative economic impact a prolonged Canada trade war could have, particularly on industries and states with heavy cross-border manufacturing ties. On the American side, business groups have been sounding their own alarm, and it is worth including their voice honestly rather than only quoting government officials. Joshua Bolten, the chief executive of the Business Roundtable, an organization representing some of the largest companies in the United States, issued a statement acknowledging the Trump administration's stated goal of addressing barriers facing American exporters, but warning that new tariffs and retaliation risk raising costs for American businesses and families, disrupting vital supply chains, and straining what has historically been one of the most important economic relationships in the world. That is a notable statement because it comes from within the American business community itself, not from a foreign government trying to defend its own position. To understand why this fight carries so much weight beyond the specific tariff percentages, you need the bigger numbers. According to figures cited by the Associated Press and CBS News, the United States and Canada sold each other roughly $880 billion worth of goods and services last year alone. Canada remains one of the two largest trading partners the United States has anywhere in the world, alongside Mexico. And the dependency runs heavily in one direction. Reporting from Al Jazeera notes that Canada relies on the United States for close to 70% of all its exports, which is precisely why some analysts argue Ottawa is negotiating from a position of real economic vulnerability, even as Carney publicly frames this as a fight Canada refuses to back down from. That vulnerability is exactly why Carney's pivot toward other trading partners earlier this year drew such a strong reaction from Washington. According to the Associated Press timeline of this dispute, back in January of this year, Carney focused on repairing Canada's trading relationship with China. And in a break from Washington's own approach toward Chinese goods, Canada agreed to cut its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Trump reportedly responded with anger, threatening an eventually unrealized 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Ottawa moved forward with a broader trade agreement with Beijing, even though Carney maintained publicly that Canada had no intention of pursuing anything that's sweeping with China. That single episode illustrates just how tightly Washington has tried to control not only its own trade relationship with Canada, but Canada's trade relationships with other countries as well. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer's own comments over the weekend add another layer to how the American side is framing responsibility for the breakdown. Speaking on Fox and Friends. Weekend, Greer said the administration had offered to cut tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber, describing them as sensitive sectors for Canada, and argued that Ottawa already had, in his words, the best deal, and still would have had an even better one, but simply did not want it. That framing, positioning Canada as the party that turned down favorable terms, stands in direct contrast to Carney's own framing of an American side that asked for too much while offering too little. And again, neither side has released the underlying draft text that would allow an outside observer to judge which characterization holds up. It is also worth remembering that this is not simply a two-country story playing out in isolation. According to the Associated Press timeline of this dispute, the same period that saw escalating tariffs on Canada also saw the Trump administration impose sweeping new tariffs on roughly 60 other trading partners around the world, including the European Union, as part of a broader effort to rebuild a tariff structure after the Supreme Court struck down the original emergency powers justification. Canada's fight with Washington, in other words, is one visible front in a much larger, simultaneous trade confrontation the United States has been waging on nearly every continent at once. So where does that leave things heading into September the 8th? As of right now, according to Al Jazeera's most recent reporting, United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer has said there are no future talks currently planned with Canada, and that Washington intends to move forward, in his words, with measures that respond to Canadian retaliation, suggesting the possibility of yet another round of American countermeasures once Canada's September the 8th tariffs actually take effect. Carney, for his part, has signaled that Canada intends to diversify away from overwhelming reliance on the American market, telling reporters his government plans to strengthen trade and even military alliances elsewhere in the world. A notable shift in tone from a country that has spent nearly a century treating the United States as its default and dominant trading partner. It is important, at this point, to be completely honest about what remains uncertain, because a story moving this quickly always carries loose threads. It is not yet confirmed exactly which specific products, beyond the broad categories Carney named, will actually appear on Canada's September the 8th tariff list, since his government said full details would be released in the coming days. It is not yet confirmed whether either side will reopen negotiations before that date arrives, despite Greer's statement that no talks are currently scheduled, because this relationship has reversed course on short notice multiple times already this year alone. And it is worth flagging that the competing accounts of exactly what was offered and rejected during last week's negotiations, one from Greer, one from Carney, cannot currently be independently verified against a single agreed-upon text, since neither government has published the actual draft terms that were on the table. To be transparent about where every piece of this script came from, the reporting drawn on here includes the Associated Press, Reuters, the Washington Post, CBS News, NBC News, CNBC, Al Jazeera, ABC News, and the Congressional Research Service, alongside direct statements from Prime Minister Mark Carney, United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and President Donald Trump himself, made through official press conferences and public social media posts. Where those sources disagreed, particularly around who is responsible for the collapse of last week's talks, that disagreement has been presented as exactly that, a disagreement rather than resolved in favor of either government's version of events. If you want to keep following this story as September the 8th approaches, and as whatever comes next between Washington and Ottawa actually unfolds, staying subscribed means you will not miss the moment either side makes its next move, because based on the pattern of the last 18 months, that next move rarely waits long. There's also a broader pattern worth sitting with for a moment before we close this one out. Every single escalation in this dispute, going all the way back to February of 2025, has followed something close to the same rhythm. A tariff or threat from Washington, a matching response from Ottawa, a period of tense negotiation, occasionally a temporary pause that raises hope of resolution, and then, more often than not, a collapse back into confrontation. The fentanyl tariffs of early 2025, the steel and aluminum tariffs of that summer, the 35% threat in August, the digital services tax standoff, and now this, a 50% tariff met with a dollar-for-dollar promise landing on September the 8th. If that pattern holds, and there is no strong evidence yet that it has broken, then September the 8th may not be the final chapter either. It may simply be the next one. For everyday people on both sides of the border, the practical impact of all this rarely shows up as a headline about tariff percentages. It shows up as a slightly higher price on a bottle of Canadian whiskey in an American liquor store, or a Canadian dairy farmer watching quota rules tighten even further, or an automotive worker in Ontario wondering whether the next round of steel tariffs reaches their own plant. That is part of why Carney, even while promising retaliation, took the unusual step of publicly admitting that Canada's own countermeasures will raise costs for Canadians too. Trade wars, whatever the political framing on either side, rarely produce a clean winner, They tend to produce higher prices, disrupted supply chains, and years of uncertainty for the businesses caught in between, which is exactly what business groups like the Business Roundtable have been warning about from inside the United States itself. There is also a longer-term question sitting quietly underneath all of this that deserves attention before we wrap up. The mandatory review of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement was always going to be a difficult negotiation, given how much has changed in trade patterns, critical minerals demand, and electric vehicle supply chains since the deal was first signed. Layering an active escalating tariff war on top of that review does not make the underlying negotiation any easier. If anything, according to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the unpredictability created by this back and forth is exactly what is undermining long-term investment decisions on both sides of the border, regardless of how September the 8th specifically plays out. A tariff can be lifted in a week. Years of lost investment confidence tend to take much longer to rebuild. It is also worth remembering that this entire confrontation exists inside a legal gray zone that is still being sorted out in American courts. The Supreme Court's ruling earlier this year against the use of emergency powers for tariffs did not end tariffs. It simply forced the administration to route around it using older, narrower legal authorities. That means the legal architecture underneath these tariffs, both the ones already in effect and whatever comes on September the 8th in response, remains genuinely unsettled. And further legal challenges are not out of the question as this dispute continues to evolve. So here is where this leaves us, heading toward the Tuesday after Labor Day. Washington has its 50% tariffs already in place, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods. Ottawa has its September the 8th deadline locked in, covering steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Both sides blame the other for the collapse of what looked, just days earlier, like a genuine breakthrough. And neither side, based on everything said publicly so far, appears ready to blink first. What do you think actually happens between now and September the 8th? Does one side find a reason to step back from the brink the way Trump briefly did with that 3-day pause? Or does this become the moment the relationship between these two countries settles into a longer, harder standoff? If you have been following this dispute since it started back in February of 2025, you have probably seen this exact cycle of escalation and near resolution play out more than once already. Let me know where you think this one lands, and I will see you in the next one.